1 week season.
What is going on, OWS fam, YouTube fam? Welcome to the week 1 edition of the OWS Angles podcast. I am your host. I am your guest. I am JMToWin. As always, throw this baby on 1.5x speed or 2x speed. And let's get started with what should be a really fun Angles podcast to kick off the season. If you're new here, welcome. And if you're new here, just a reminder, every year, 1 week season, we make it free for week 1. So check out oneweekseason.com. Why do we make it free? Well, OWS is not a game of picking players. So the typical DFS site, DFS is not a game of picking players. The typical DFS site is focused on providing picks because that's what most consumers want. Picks doesn't really help us win tournaments. You have to be winning tournaments, finishing up near the top, or at least in the top 0.1% in order to have that ROI that makes DFS a profitable endeavor. So because of the math on things, you're not going to hit that top 0.1% every week. But the idea is that every week you're positioning yourself to be ahead of the math so that over time you are hitting enough of those that your bankroll is growing. Your graph is moving up and to the right over time. And a big part of that is the strategy and theory behind DFS and how to put together rosters and how to think about things in different tournament sizes and different styles and whatnot. And so we do focus on picks and breaking down the whole slate and all that, but we also focus heavily on helping our users understand how to play DFS, how to maximize their ROI in DFS over time. And so as we always say, OWS is really, it's built for the people that it's targeting. And so if you come to the site, you tend to have a sense really quickly of if the site is for you or not, because a lot of people will come to the site and they say, this isn't really a fit for what I'm looking for. But if you come to OWS and you say, this is a fit for what I've been looking for, then we're probably the only site that is doing what we're doing in terms of what you're looking for. And so we tend to be a really good fit for the people we are a fit for. So because of that, we like to make the site free week 1. That means everything. That means projections, ownership projections, the optimizer, the sims, everything is free week 1. So be sure to check that out. What is the Angles podcast? Well, the Angles podcast evolves over time, but the idea here is for me to have a chance to talk through some of the high level components of the slate, or every once in a while to take some deeper cuts into the slate. So I write up content throughout the week on OWS. I have my player grid in the scroll on OWS on the weekends, which the scroll is all of our late week content in one place. And my player grid is essentially my player pool that I'm fishing from. And so I've tried, there was a couple of years there where the Angles podcast, I kind of felt it was redundant. I also have a show with Pete Overzet on Fridays on his channel, and it was kind of covering the same stuff that I'd cover with Pete, some of the same stuff that I had covered in the player grid or throughout the week. And so we found ways over the last couple of years, to make the Angles podcast something complementary and something that gives you insight that you're not seeing in the other places. So a lot of times it's going to be talking about the shape of the slate or how we can be thinking about that slate from a strategy perspective. And but every week we have opportunities to do something a little bit different. So this week is going to be, I think, really cool. What I want to do today is dive into my player grid, and particularly the bottom of the player grid, which is where I think a lot of people go first, and talk about how I would consider using the player grid if I were a subscriber, or how I would prescribe to a subscriber to think about my player grid, to use my player grid. And then we're actually going to go through some rosters that I built last night, Thursday night, and take a look at what my process was in building those rosters, what my thinking was in building those rosters, and how I leveraged the player grid, so to speak. Now I created the player grid, my player pool, but if I were a subscriber, how I would be looking at that. Or as the person who created it, it's like, okay, here's my pool. How am I using that? Because it's not just taking this pool and saying, okay, how do I build a roster using only these players? And I think that's important to recognize. So we're going to go through some rosters, be able to see my thought processes and how I'm building those. And then we'll look at putting those into the sims and actually seeing what the ROI looks like on those rosters and how we can leverage that information. And again, the sims are free week 1. It's if you do single roster sims, it's $20 a month. If you do the full sims package, it's $150. a month. So premium product, and you get that for free in week one. And so I think it's really valuable just to tap into it and have that tool for week one. So not everyone's bankroll supports that addition of Sims, justifying that addition of Sims, but you can get a chance in week one to use that for free, a super premium product, and really kind of leverage the power that gives you in terms of building. Shout out to FTN, who great site, great company, built the optimizer that we use and the Sims that we're using. And yeah, really excited about being able to leverage that this season. But first, let's go ahead and talk about how I would leverage the player grid. So if you are listening on a podcast feed, or if you're listening on YouTube instead of watching on YouTube, no worries. All of this is going to be talked through out loud as if you're listening, because that's how I listen to everything. Is I don't typically watch, I typically listen. So we are sharing the screen here today, but we'll be able to, you don't have to look at the screen if that's not what you're doing. Okay, so we're at the bottom of my player grid, and I think this is where a lot of people jump to first. So actually, let's go to the top of the player grid. If you come to OWS, you've got the scroll and you can jump around from article to article. I think a lot of these are not yet populated because they'll come out Friday, Saturday. But you can jump around from article to article, and you can jump straight to my player grid. So at the top, you'll have my bottom-up build, which we'll get to at the end of today's podcast. And you'll have some thoughts on the slate. You'll have my blue chip plays, my light blue chip plays, and all this. But I think what a lot of people probably do is they jump down to the bottom. The easiest way to do that is to click on the article below mine, which is Mike's player grid, and then scroll up. And they probably jump down to the bottom and just want to see my tightest pool. So you got this this paywall blocker for, I see all this on the back end. You won't see this if you are logged in. Again, everything free week one. But this is my pool, quote, if building for single entry 3 max. And I say this is my narrowest pool, which means it's the pool likeliest to change a bit as I move deeper into builds. If it changes through Saturday night, I'll add an update in this space. If I were building for single entry 3 max, my tightened up player pool would be, and so you see my quarterbacks. It's all of this is in front of the paywall, so to speak, this week. So I can show this on YouTube because everything on OWS is free this week. So not taking anything away from subscribers here. So you got my quarterback pool, which you see is Baker Mayfield with some Michael Penix trail bets, Joe Flacco, Kyler Murray, and possibly Trevor Lawrence on tighter builds as well. Now, again, this was created on Thursday, a day early. It usually comes out Friday evening. Week one, we do things a little bit early. So it came out Thursday evening. Things might change, right? So this isn't telling you who to play on the slate. None of the player grid is telling you who to play on the slate. The idea is just here, and I try to always emphasize that, right? Like Jamar Chase isn't featured in my player grid this week. There are reasons. I talk about it in the player grid, but I'm not saying don't play Jamar Chase. I'm not saying he's a bad play. He's in fact a good play if you play him correctly, but it's just not where I'm focusing this week. So it's very important to recognize that the player grid is not a list of all the good plays. The player grid is what I am looking at that week, and then also how I would use this information. So I'm going to build some MME rosters that don't have these 4 quarterbacks, Baker, Flacco, Kyler, Trevor Lawrence. I am going to potentially have some single entry 3 max rosters that don't have these 4 quarterbacks, but this is my main pool. This is the main place I'm looking. If I'm building 150 rosters in the optimizer, I am going to be looking through those and picking out the ones I want to use for single entry and 3 max, or to think about using for single entry 3 max, or that might seed some ideas for me that I can say, okay, I like this roster, but I want to change some things, hand build some things on here for the single entry 3 max. But I'm going to be primarily shopping through in my mind and in the bink machine rosters that start with these quarterbacks. So then we get down to running back, and a much bigger pool, as is typically the case at the running back position. So we've got Bijan Robinson, Christian McCaffrey, barring calf health, Jonathan Taylor, Devon Achane, Alvin Kamara, James Conner, Chuba Hubbard, and a little low-cost dart there in Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt. Then we get to wide receiver, and as I was building the grid on Thursday this week, I kept thinking, I've got to add more guys in here, right? This isn't, it looks long because there's some notes and whatnot, but it's not a very long list. There's the 2 Bucs wide receivers. There's Brian Thomas Jr. and some notes behind him. There's Malik Neighbors, Tyreek Hill, Darnell Mooney. There's Cooper Kupp, who I may or may not use on tighter builds, as I mentioned here, Marvin Harrison Jr., and Josh Downs. Not a very big list, really, when it comes down to, I'm going to take a whole slate of 12 games, narrow it down to my favorite plays. And then we've got the tight end positions, a smaller list, David Njoku, Kyle Pitts as part of a bet on this game environment, George Kittle, and Trey McBride. So when I'm looking through this list, I think that one of the mistakes that a lot of people make is that they think about this and imagine that I'm saying, okay, only build on single entry 3 max, only take players from this pool and only build with players from this pool. But that's not at all what I'm saying. And the idea here with single entry 3 max is, and we're going to talk about this more as we get to the Sims section, but the smaller the tournament field, the less risk we need to take on. If we are competing against 20,000 rosters, so again, keep in mind, the goal is always first place. That's what we're thinking about in our mind is first place. That's where the money is. It's asymmetric payouts in DFS tournaments. That's why we like DFS tournaments, why we play tournaments instead of cash games, double ups and 50-50s. Because we're playing tournaments instead of cash games, double ups and 50-50s, we shouldn't be targeting how do we get into the money. Getting into the money means finishing roughly in the top 20% of a tournament field and roughly doubling your money. Well, wouldn't it be more smart to target 50-50s and double ups if we're just looking to double our money? And then you just got to finish roughly in the top 50% of the field or head to head and beat one other person in order to double your money, as opposed to trying to beat 80% of the field in order to double your money. So there can be this thought of like, yeah, but if I get into the money and I do it often enough, eventually I'll have the week where I'm finishing in first place. But actually the type of roster that you're building to finish in the money doesn't necessarily correlate directly to what you would need to be doing in order to finish up near the top of the tournament field. So as we get into larger contests, 20,000 entries, yeah, if you finish 10th out of 20,000, you're gonna be happy with that. You're still gonna get a good payout. I'm not saying you have to finish in first place, but you need to be targeting those first place finishes. You need to be thinking about how would this roster get to first place. How would this roster have the highest score out of 20,000 roster? And it's not just about maximizing points, right? It's about maximizing what can happen, how you take advantage of things going wrong for other people, or where the field might be wrong, or where you can zig when other people are zagging, and where you just need to zag when other people are zagging and just do the same thing as other people. It's not all about just being completely contrarian across the bill. There's a whole lot that goes into this. We talk about it all the time throughout the season. So if you're an OWS subscriber, you understand this. If you're newer to the site, you'll continue to pick this stuff up over time about how we want to think about building rosters and maximizing our ROI on these rosters. But what you want to do trying to beat 20,000 entries is going to be different from what you need to do trying to beat 100 entries, 300 entries. So when I say single entry 3 max, what I'm basically saying is these are the players that as I'm filling in the other parts of my roster, I want to be ideally trying to pull from this pool, because these are the guys who I feel like, and I'm thinking, okay, if it's 500 entries or fewer, or even 2,000 entries or fewer, especially if it's 300 entries or fewer. And I'm saying, yes, I'm targeting ceiling, but I also want to build in as much floor as I can. These are the plays that stand out to me in that regard. So the larger the tournament field, the less I'm worried about layering in floor. The smaller the tournament field, the more I want to think about who are the guys who have secure roles. They don't need a lot to go right in order to have that 17, 19, 20 point score, and they have pathways to that 30, 35 point score. We can't always know when that 30 to 35 point DraftKings score is coming. What we can know is a player who's in a good spot for that type of score, and is their workload large enough and consistent enough? Are they good enough players? The matchup good enough? Is the game environment good enough that we feel like even if they miss, they're probably not killing my roster. Even if they miss, they're probably getting me, depending on price tag, 15 points, 18 points, 20, 22 points. And I'm not rostering them for 15 to 18 to 22 points. I'm rostering them for this 30 to 35 pointer. But if they miss, I want to make sure that they can kind of land in this range. And so that can come down to, in terms of my tighter player pool, that can come down to individual players, or it can come down to an offense that I feel confident somebody from this group of players is going to have this type of game. That's actually an interesting little side note here. We talk about it in the player grid, so I won't dive too deep into it here, but there are a few spots in the player grid where, so broadly speaking, and this is all generalities, but broadly speaking, DraftKings over time is going to price players. This is important in case you've never heard me say this before. DraftKings is going to price players in such a way that they'll hit roughly 4x their salary, roughly 25% of the time. Now, there's broad ranges of how this works. Sometimes it's a guy who only hits that like 15% of the time, but when he hits it, he tends to go way over, right? Like a more volatile player who's going to have a bunch of sub 10 point scores, but then this like 29 to 35 point score. I think Deebo Samuel, 2-3 years ago, whatever, when he was healthy with the 49ers, the type of guy who, you're paying kind of a higher price tag because when he hits for a 5x or a 5.5x or a 6x, but the consistency isn't there like it is on some other guys. But generally speaking, that's what we're going to get. 20 to 25% of the time, once out of every 4 to 5 games, a player should hit about 4x their. But the math gets a little bit funky here. If you're trying to get This is where stacks are so valuable. If you're trying to get 3 different guys who are totally uncorrelated to each hit their once every 4 games outcome, that's going to happen about 1.5% of the time. So in other words, you pick random running back, great play, it's going to hit 4x the salary once every 4 weeks. Random wide receiver, another random wide receiver, all priced appropriately, all are going to hit 4x their salary once every 4 games. Well, in order for them to all do that on a game together is sub 2% chance of that happening. It's like if you flip a coin, what are your chances of getting heads 3 times in a row? It's 12.5%, right? Because you got to go 50%, then cut that in 50% down to 25, cut that in 50% down to 12.5. So it's kind of like that same thought, that same math, except you're cutting 25% down by 75%. Then you're cutting that down by 75%. And so you start to realize that in order to get a full roster of 9 spots correct, the math really starts to get lower there of what it takes to do that. So we're always looking for ways to turn the math in our favor. So one of the ways we can do that is we talk about it with we'll get to a Kyler build here in a minute, but last year in games that Trey McBride played, he missed 1 game, and games that Trey McBride played, Kyler plus Marvin Harrison Jr. plus Trey McBride would have gotten you into this range of scoring, these 3 guys put together, about 18% of the time. So where other people are picking 3 random uncorrelated players, this is one of the reasons why Jaden Daniels is less powerful in DFS than his raw score would make it seem. Because last year, at least, you weren't getting a stacking partner with him. The best games from Terry McLaurin still weren't matching what you needed at his price tag. So you're getting a good, strong score from Jaden Daniels, but covering only 1 spot in doing that. So if Jaden Daniels is going to hit, let's say Jaden Daniels is going to hit 28% of the time, 30% of the time, but then you still need to cover that wide receiver and tight end spot. Maybe you're playing Jaden Daniels solo, and you still need to cover that wide receiver and tight end spot with 2 other uncorrelated bets. The math still comes out way worse on Jaden plus this uncorrelated wide receiver plus this uncorrelated tight end than the math on last year Kyler plus McBride plus Marvin Harrison Jr. Even though they're hitting less frequently, you're covering 3 spots when they do hit. So that really turns the math in our favor. But other ways that we can look to turn the math in our favor is, actually, let's go ahead. This is a little bit further down in my notes, and then we'll get back to where this fit in here in just a moment. But I was looking at this last night, games that Tyreek and Achane played last year with Tua on the field. So we had 10 games of Achane and Tyreek with Tua on the field. So that means 20 opportunities for us to get points from one of these 2 guys. So instead of 10 games of Achane, 10 games of Tyreek, taking them separately, let's take them together, 20 games total, right? Now, there was a game against the Rams where both of them posted a dud. Rams, one of the top 5 or 6 defenses in football. There was a game against Houston where both of them posted a dud. So another one of the top 5 or 6 defenses in football. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to throw out those games, and I am going to take the other 8 games that they played with Tua. So now we have a sample of 16 opportunities to get a strong score. Well, in all 8 of those games, one of these 2 players posted 20 plus points. In 12 opportunities out of these 16 total opportunities, both of these guys, or one of these 2 guys, let's say like this, in 12 out of 16 total opportunities, we got 18.9 or more points. So 75% of the time, we got 18.9 or more points, or in other words, cut that in half, 75%, cut that in half down to 37.5%. Basically, if you just played mixed and matched Tyreek and Achane, you had a 37.5% chance of getting around 20 points. Now, we always want to think about the ceiling. We always want to think about the salary multipliers. So let's look at their high-end scores. 29, 26.7, 32.1, 31.1, 34. So you could kind of think of this as like mix and match. And if you just mixed and matched Achane every week that Tua was playing and they were in a good match, right? If we don't think that the Colts this week are in that class of the Rams and the Texans, then we could say that we've got about a 75% chance or a 37.5% chance just mixing and matching these 2 guys of getting 20 plus points. And what is this? 5 out of these 16 opportunities, one of these guys posted 26.7 or more. So again, that's about a third of the time, and then cut that in half because we're looking at one of the two guys. So about 16, 17% of the time, you're getting one of these high-end scores. They're both kind of underpriced. So you're going to have this not just 26.7, which is 4x for both of them, but 29, 31.1, 32.1, 34. So these really high-end scores. And so we sort of land on this situation where you realize, okay, mathematically, you could justify just mixing and matching Tyreek Hill and Achane across a chunk of rosters and feeling confident there. So that's really what I'm looking for in these single entry 3 max type players, is the types of players that the math works in their favor. So the best way to turn the math in your favor is a place where you're correlating what you're doing and you're saying, if I get this right, yes, it's going to happen less often, but if I get this right, I'm still turning the math in my favor because it's going to get 3 spots right, 4 spots right, depending on if it's a full game stack and you're really betting on this high-end outcome, 5 spots right on my roster by positioning things in this way. But on top of that, you need to fill out the rest of your roster with spots that are turning the math in your favor, especially in smaller field contests. So again, the larger the tournament field, the more we can think, okay, yeah, this guy could post a total dud, or this 3K guy could post 2 points, he could post 20 points, right? The number of times that I've finished near the top or at the top of large field mass multi-entry contests because my defense scored 20 and I had a 3K or 3,500 wide receiver who scored 20, that like dramatically high percent of my high-end finishes in large field mass multi-entry tournaments were because one or both of those things happened, right? This cheap piece, your defense, or this cheap wide receiver ends up putting up the type of score that you're really targeting at 5K, 6K at another position. And all of a sudden, you've just got these bonus points, and then the rest of your roster is able to make up for things from there. So in these larger field contests, we often have to take on a little bit more risk, a little bit lower floor, because finishing in the money doesn't help us. It's not about the idea of floor isn't about how do we finish in the money. The idea of floor is we can't always predict when the spikes will come, but if we're taking players who are consistently in position to get those spikes, who are consistently posting higher scores, then at worst, they're still on track to help our rosters. We get 2 or 3 guys who spike out of our 9 players on our roster, and we get the rest of the guys kind of finish at these higher end scores. We're still probably finishing the money, maybe in the top 10%, maybe in the top 7 or 8%, maybe even the top 4 or 5% in a smaller field contest. And then if we get that extra spike from there, now we have a shot at finishing up in the money. And so that's what this smaller field pool, the single entry 3 max, my tightest pool, is focused on, is this idea of who are the guys who I feel confident are turning the math in our favor. It's not that I'm saying, let me just build a roster using only these guys, but I'm saying, where are the pieces that when I'm filling in those final pieces on my roster, I can sort of pull from this pool? And it doesn't have to all be from this pool, but these are the players that I can have higher confidence in. Okay, so the next thing that we are going to do is look at some rosters that I was messing around with last night. So there's an exercise I like to do where I like to build a roster. I don't get to do this every week of the season because there's a lot going on with content and a 4-year-old, a 6-year-old, and whatever. Thankfully we got a great team at OWS. I don't have to handle much of the business stuff, but there are always things I need to handle, especially early in the season. And so between everything that goes into this, and then basically my mind being consumed with NFL thoughts and ideas and thinking through the slates and learning as much as I can every single week, I don't always have time to go through this exercise. But I try to anytime I can. One of my favorite exercises is to build a roster around a practice build around every single team on the slate, every single game on the slate, I should say. So I'll go through the app and pick a game. So you see this first roster that we've pulled up here, if you're watching, is a Drake May roster. Well, this is going through the app. The very first game in the app is Las Vegas at New England, and then saying, okay, what's the roster I can build here? Will I use this roster? I have no idea, right? And that's kind of part of the exercise, is saying, I don't know if I'm going to use this roster. I'm not building this roster in order to use it. I'm building this roster in order to practice. It's actually something I would strongly encourage you to do, but also to not just do this by rote mechanics of just filling in a roster, but actually trying to think through it. And what this ends up doing is leading you down different pathways of thought. This was building this roster is where I started really thinking about this. I've got Achane and Tyreek in the player grid, but then started really thinking about, okay, like how does the math work on the either or between these two with Tua playing? And how confident am I in just saying, okay, where I can, I want to try to put one of these guys in. It's not saying 100% of my rosters I'm going to have one of these guys, but where are these spots that I can say, okay, if I can, let me pull one of these guys in. So if we kind of dive in, try to flow state yourself into this space where you're really thinking through what you're doing here, you can really challenge your thinking, find new pathways. And even though you're not necessarily using this Drake May roster as one of your core rosters, it might lead to something important that is part of one of your core rosters. Really, DFS, NFL DFS is a bit like the NFL, right? In that there's so much parity in the NFL. And it's often, almost every game, it's 2 or 3 plays that are going to decide how that game turns out. It's fun to pile on Belichick these days because of everything that has transpired over the last few years, but especially over the last year or so, and especially last weekend with that first game. But still a great coach. And one of the things that he would say was, there's 2 or 3 games that decide every game, and they're not always, those plays are not always at the end of the game. And Ernie Adams, who's long time basically Belichick's secret weapon sidekick. And Ernie Adams was on Julian Edelman's podcast recently, and he quoted Bill Belichick as having said, look, guys, if I could tell you which play in the game was going to be that critical play, I know all of you would give 100% effort on that play, but we don't know what play is going to be that play or what plays are going to be those plays that end up being the difference in the game. So we have to give 100% effort all the time, right? That's kind of how this practice building of the rosters is. It's like a lot of times you come out of a weekend, a good DFS weekend, and you feel so much confidence. You're like, man, I'm so good at this. And then you look at your roster and you're like, man, one decision, right? You finish in first place, one decision between this 3,400 wide receiver and this 3,500 wide receiver, and you pick the one that broke your way. And that was the difference between 12 points or 14 points. And that was the difference between you finishing in first place in the contest or finishing in 336th place in the contest, where first place might be a $10,000 payout and 336th place might be a $50 payout, right? It's that one little decision. And we cannot hone our craft down to a point where it's like, okay, I'm definitely going to make that decision right every week. What we can do is position ourselves so that we're constantly putting ourselves in a position where those decisions have opportunities to break our way, where we're 1 or 2 decisions away, and where in those decisions, we're constantly making sharp decisions, things that turn the math in our favor, and recognizing where our edges are and where they're not. In other words, okay, one roster has this guy, one roster has the other guy, because there is no discernible edge between these two, but this could end up being the difference in how things play out. And so these practice builds, I think, can be critical. Practice build, something I've talked about for 10 plus years now, of one of the most valuable things that I do and that I encourage people to do. And I will continue to hammer that until 100% of you are building some practice rosters every week. And again, not just going through by rote mechanics and just plugging in players, but really kind of thinking through the roster. So this roster you see, we've got, I don't plan to build. I don't expect this game to shoot out, right? So I'm not sitting here saying, oh man, I want a Drake May, Travion Henderson, Stephon Diggs roster. Currently, I don't expect to have any of these rosters in my 150 rosters. But I have thought about, man, Stephon Diggs. I mean, we can even pull up these game logs now. This is a different offense. This is playing in Houston. This is pre-ACL tear, but it's also playing as the number 2/3 wideout. And we see, again, looking at what is the sort of floor that you can bounce off of. So take out week 8 where he ends up getting injured, and you've got 22 points, 20, 19, we're rounding up or down as required, 20, and then this lower end game of 14, right? And then a couple games in the 7-point range. But you see a guy who it's like, man, at 5,300, if he were putting up 20 points per week, well, then he clearly can bounce up to a 27-point or 30-point or whatever it might be. And you realize he's still, a couple years removed from being considered one of the top 10 wide receivers in the NFL. And so I have thought about Stephon Diggs, right? Large field tournaments, throw some Stephon Diggs in there. Travion Henderson, I would expect that week 1, the Patriots end up saying, hey, yeah, Ramondre Stevenson's our veteran. We're going to lead off with him. And then Travion Henderson throughout the season is going to take this larger and larger share of the workload. So I would expect kind of like 50-50 in week 1, or maybe even 55-45 in favor of Ramondre. But practice build, I'm saying, okay, what if we tell a story on this roster, right? And this is an important thing too that we always talk about at OWS is every roster is unique. It's independent of other rosters. It's telling its own story. So I might have Travion Henderson on one roster out of 150. On 149 rosters, I am telling a story of Travion Henderson not being a piece that you had to have on this weekend. But on this one roster, the story's different. On this one roster, I'm saying TreVeyon Henderson has a big game. TreVeyon Henderson takes over the lead back role this week, or he hits for multiple long runs. He goes for over 100 yards. He scores 2 touchdowns, whatever it might be. TreVeyon Henderson on this roster. So I ended up putting Ashton Jeanty on this roster and then ended up moving things around to where Ashton Jeanty just barely didn't fit. And so I went a different direction. Where I actually ended up, and I'll throw him on here right now, is Dante Thornton. And Dante Thornton, 3,600, is going to be on the field. So I would expect 65 to 70% of the plays outside receiver, rookie, who nobody's going to be thinking about. So at the moment we put Dante Thornton on this roster, this is clearly not a smaller field roster. This is week 1 where there's a lot of value, where you don't necessarily have to pay all the way down to 3,600 for a guy who you really know nothing about how they're going to use him and how he's going to perform. If you don't know Dante Thornton, I think he's 6'5" and runs like a 4.3 40. So in terms of tools, right, there's not a lot of players in NFL history who have his tools. Calvin Johnson and Randy Moss, right? There's not many others who have the skill or the athletic profile of Dante Thornton. And he has ascended to a starting role for the Raiders this offseason. And maybe that would have changed with Amari Cooper signed. But now, yesterday, Amari Cooper retired. So Dante Thornton's going to be on the field. The question is just how much are they throwing outside the numbers? No Christian Gonzalez this week. So I do think Dante Thornton's a worthwhile, or expecting no Christian Gonzalez. I do think he's a worthwhile dart throw in large field contests. But also, the floor is low. It won't surprise us if he has 3 points. It won't surprise me if he has 15, 16, 17 points. But also, if he does that, that might be one of only 2 times all year that he does that. So that's kind of the profile of somebody like Dante Thornton here. The moment we put him on a roster like this, we know we're kind of A, treating this as a practice build, and B, saying, okay, this is a large field contest type of roster. Now, we've got this Patriots story. The story here is I don't want Drake May to have 20 points. If I'm putting Drake May on this roster, I'm saying he puts up 25, 27, maybe even 30 points. So Diggs is part of that. I'm saying Henderson's part of that. But I'm also saying this is a higher scoring game. So now I have to ask, is this a higher scoring game because the Patriots are running away with it, or is it a higher scoring game because it's sort of back and forth? Dante Thornton covers both of those categories. So Patriots could win 30-7, and Dante Thornton could still be critically involved in this. But also, knowing Josh McDaniels, knowing Mike Vrabel, the way that they're likeliest to have a game where Drake May is putting up 30 points is a game in which the Raiders are also scoring points. And so Dante Thornton fits that as well, because how would this game get ratcheted up? It would be some big plays and some quick scoring, and Dante Thornton fits into that category. So next up, I'm going to go over to running back. And we've already talked about the math behind the Tyreek and Achane thing. And so in this spot, what I wanted to do was basically say, okay, I want one of where am I at right here? Basically say I want one of, somebody got Bijan Robinson on here. Okay, now what we're looking to do. I want one of Achane or Tyreek. So right here on this particular roster, I am going to throw Achane in at the running back spot. So if you're listening, we now have Drake May, TreVeyon Henderson, Stephon Diggs, and Dante Thornton. And now we've thrown in Achane at the running back position. So this is where we start to see how I can leverage the player grid, right? So the next thing that I do is I say, okay, I've kind of spent up now on Achane. So where's a place where I can save a little bit of salary? David Njoku, one of my favorite tight ends on this slate, core piece of the player grid. Now, let me layer him in. Part of this too is, even though it's large field play, I'm saying the math on a Drake May, TreVeyon Henderson, Stephon Diggs, Dante Thornton package deal paying off the way that we need it to pay off. So these guys cost around 20K in salary. So for these guys combining for 80 to 100 points, that's pretty low probability stuff. So we don't necessarily, even in large field play, we don't necessarily want to layer in a bunch of other low probability stuff on top of this. We've taken our low probability risk. And so now we can, and realistically, right, what are the chances of getting 4 spots, right, at a 4x to 5x? Well, now we're saying like 0.4%. It's going to happen like once every 250 rosters that just 4 random uncorrelated players would land on this together. So even though Drake May, TreVeyon Henderson, Stephon Diggs, Dante Thornton are lower probability than other stacks that you could start with, it's still higher probability that this hits than once every 250 games, right? If we played out this game 250 times, there would be probably more than one time in which this whole package would hit together. And so we're still ahead of the math here. We're probably behind the math on sharper stacks, but we're ahead of the math in terms of just like 9 uncorrelated spots. Now, because we're a little bit behind the math on other stacks, again, we want to say, okay, who are some sharp plays that we can layer in here? So You've got David Njoku, and then I'm going to say, okay, who's another piece that I feel highly confident in? One of the core pieces of my player grid. I want to have a lot of these Bucks wide receivers, which are really just two guys, Mike Evans and Emeka Egbuka. So let's throw Mike Evans in here and see if this is going to work. And all of a sudden we realize, okay, we're sitting pretty with salary now. And what we can actually do here is do something really unique where talk about taking away some uncertainty. We're going to put in the best defense on the slate, probably the best defense in the NFL, and the Broncos playing at home against a rookie quarterback in his first NFL start. Now, we think Cam Ward is going to be a good quarterback, but it's still a rookie quarterback in his first NFL start. And you look through this slate, and it's really what quarterbacks are we attacking on this slate? It's week one. We don't have a bunch of backups. We don't have a bunch of bad quarterbacks on this slate. So you've got Justin Fields, but on a team that's going to run the ball a lot, and you've got Spencer Rattler, but he's at home and he's playing a Cardinals defense that's well coached and good, but they're not aggressive and they don't, they're not a scary defense. And so you can kind of say, well, Broncos have a pretty good shot at being the top scoring defense. Most people won't pay $3,800 for a defense. And so now we've got this. And then what does this leave us with the salary for? One of the top players on the slate. And we're going to go Jamar Chase here because, well, as we've said in the player grid, I won't explore it here in the interest of time, but you want to be playing Jamar Chase in spots where you are betting on the game shooting out. So why is that? Well, let's pull up Jamar Chase's game log really quickly. A tremendously high floor. All these 20-point games here, you got, 18.4, 11.3, 17.6, 12.2, 17.5, 7.5, 12.2, right? There are some games in here that's like, oh yeah, that would actually hurt your roster, but 17.5, even at his price tag, doesn't hurt. If you're getting 20 plus, you can still win elsewhere. You're uphill battle now if you've gotten 17 points from your $8,100 player, but still, like the fact that he so consistently gets around 20 points is positive. But what we need from him is this 48.1 pointer. What we need from him is this 58.4 pointer. What we need is this 44.3, this 32.8. And I guess we are getting to it now, but as we got to in the player grid and throughout the week, what were the scores in these games? 33 to 38, 38 to 41, 34 to 35, 69 plus points, total points scored in 3 of these 4 games where Jamar Chase was a difference maker on the slate. The only one where that wasn't the case was this 48.1 pointer against Dallas in a 27 to 20 game. So really, at a guy who's going to be one of the highest owned players on the slate, you really need a shootout in order for Jamar Chase to have the math in his favor. And so at the very least, I want to have a piece of the Browns on a Jamar Chase roster because it's highly likely that a piece from the Browns is hitting in this situation. So then we throw Jamar Chase on here. And you could really argue that even a roster like this isn't good enough for putting Jamar Chase on it, that you really want to go from May down to Flacco and then turn this into a different type of stack. But then we're overhauling this whole roster. This is a practice build. You can kind of see how my process or what my process looked like for building this particular roster. All right, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take a look at a Trevor Lawrence build. This is going to take a little bit less time, but again, how are we leveraging the player grid? How are we leveraging the ways that I'm looking at things and thinking about things? This build, right? If I'm playing Trevor Lawrence, I am not hoping for him to put up, he's 5,300, right? We get in this trap of thinking like, oh, if he puts up 20 points, that's great. If he puts up 20 points and then you're stacking him with other guys, like you're actually turning the math against you. Because not to say that if he puts up 20 points, you're going to be, throwing a brick through your window or whatever, but hopefully not doing that anyway over DFS. But you're not saying that like you're frustrated if you get that score, but that's not the score you're targeting. So you're putting Trevor Lawrence on here and saying, how does he win me a tournament? Well, Trevor Lawrence is capable, and he'll probably do it at least once this year. He's capable of 300 plus yards and 4 touchdowns. If he doesn't do that once this year, then he's going to have 300 plus yards and 3 touchdowns once or twice this year, maybe even, 3 times, right? And so we are putting Trevor Lawrence on a roster and saying, how does he top the slate? He tops the slate throwing a bunch of touchdown passes. And if he's throwing 4 touchdown passes, now we're putting Trevor Lawrence on here. We're taking the price tag off. We're not saying, hopefully we get 20 points because he's 5.3K. We're saying, hopefully we get a 30-pointer, a 35-pointer. Hopefully he's the quarterback you had to have. So now on this roster, let's build for that scenario. So there's 2 ways you could do it. You could throw on 2 pass catchers. On this particular roster, I'm actually throwing on 3 wide receivers. So if this happened once in a season, then that's 5.9% of games, right? If we get this 1 game per season that Trevor Lawrence throws for 300 yards and 4 touchdowns, That's 5.9% of games. That's well ahead of the math that we need, covering 4 spots on our roster where other people, 4 uncorrelated spots, going to be 1 out of every 250 games. Again, just very simple math here. And there's broad ranges that you can swing through on all that. But keeping things simple in general for these discussions, 1 out of every 250 games versus 1 out of every 18, 19 games. Yeah, like I'll take that. Also on these spots where you're putting on 4 guys, it really doesn't matter exactly who gets the points. There can be this tendency, like if you're getting up to the milli maker, you need to be perfect. You need to be like 100% right on that roster, and you can't take anything wrong, right? But if you are in any other contest, basically, you're not going to be frustrated if on this roster, De'Ami Brown gets 4 points, but this entire block of players that you're spending just over 20K, probably around 21K on, you're paying, spend about 21K. You're not going to be frustrated if this block of players that you're spending 21K on goes for 90 to 100 points, but one of the individual players ended up getting you only 4 or only 7, right? And as the points were concentrated on other guys. The reason why you're not going to be frustrated and why that's not going to kill you is because this isn't a spot where, like, if 10% of the field had Trevor Lawrence, Brian Thomas Jr., Travis Hunter, and no De'Ami Brown, and you had the stack with De'Ami Brown and De'Ami Brown posts a dud, well, like that's okay. Like, I mean, that wouldn't be okay. That's where you're behind the field because now 10% of the field is ahead of you and you took the dud. But that's not going to be the case. If we have Trevor Lawrence plus Brian Thomas Jr. plus Travis Hunter on more than 0.5%, 0.7% of rosters in an entire tournament, that would be surprising. Also, what if De'Ami Brown's the one who hits instead of Travis Hunter? Now people don't have that one, right? And so just putting these guys on here together and saying, like, look, taking a dud is okay because I'm talking about what I'm getting for the block of salary spent and turning the math in my favor as much as possible for this block of salary spent. We're going to bring this back with Chuba Hubbard. And this is basically saying, typically in a game like this, you would say people tend to think toward wide receiver because you're telling a story of the Jags scoring a bunch of points and therefore the running backs aren't good, right? But look at this game Thursday night with the Cowboys and the Eagles. If an offense is scoring points, the running back has opportunities to score multiple touchdowns, right? Look at Javonte Williams scoring 2 touchdowns in that game. He can't run more than 10 yards down the field without somebody catching him, and yet he gets these 2 touchdowns because the offense keeps getting down there. And so somebody like Chuba Hubbard, who's going to be involved in the passing attack, who's going to be involved on the ground, just a back and forth game could be a great game environment for him. So we're going to throw him in here to continue painting that picture. So now we've got 5 spots covered, and we're saying, maybe once every 25 games between these 2 teams, once every 30 games between these 2 teams, we're getting these 5 spots right. Well, that's great math in terms of what other people are looking at. Where other people are getting 5 uncorrelated spots right, that's 1 out of every 1,000 times. And we're saying even if this is just once out of every 100 games between these 2, this would pay off. You're putting yourself way ahead of the math on this one. So now we've got this, and what do we want to do from here? Well, we want to think about who are some of the core pieces from the player grid? Who are some of the places where we feel confident that we're maximizing our floor, we're maximizing our chances of ceiling? We want a piece from the Dolphins. We want a piece from the Bucks. We want a piece from the Cardinals. We want a piece from the 49ers. Those are all spots that I'm considering. So let's see with the Bucks if we could throw Achane in here. From the Dolphins. Let's see if we can throw Achane in here. Let's go over to tight end and see if we can throw Kittle in here. Let's go over to defense and take the Steelers, another tremendous defense facing a quarterback that we can potentially attack. What does that leave us with? Oh, perfect. We can fit one of these Bucks pieces in Mike Evans at 6,600. So you kind of see you've got this core stack, and then it's filled out from there with pieces that are from these places I'm trying to pull from, right? Where you've got a Dolphins piece, you've got a 49ers piece, and you've got a Bucks piece, and then a defense that we like. And then the last thing that we are going to take a look at is messed up something right here. Give me one moment. Let's see, this is the right roster. We are going to take a look at, there we go, share this tab instead. We're going to take a look at a Kyler Murray build. So actually, let me clear out some of this because what we start with is Kyler Murray plus Trey McBride and Marvin Harrison Jr. We're going to leave the Steelers in here. We won't dive into the math on this one, but we explored it in the player grid. Very short of it is that Trey McBride, I guess we talked about it earlier in the show, but Trey McBride missed 1 game last year. So 3 out of 16 games, these guys all hit together. And so again, math strongly in our favor here. And this is a stack that I do like this week. And so what we're going to do then is we're going to say, what are some different ways that we can build this? So We're going to throw Kamara in here. It's not necessary to have a bring back here because you could paint a picture of just a blowout where the Cardinals are throwing the ball and getting their touchdowns through the air. But we're going to go ahead and play this as a game in which somebody from the Saints comes back. One of the reasons I like it is because people aren't going to feel comfortable playing Saints players this week. So much negativity around the team, and the perceptions of this team and this offense are not positive. And so I think getting some Saints players on some rosters is plus EV this week. Plus EV meaning plus expected value. If we could run out this slate 100 times, would this make you money or lose you money? I think it would make you money because it would hit at a high enough rate to be valuable at the low ownership. So then especially if I already want to say, hey, I want some Rashid Shaheed this week. I want some Chris Olave this week. I want some Alvin Kamara. Maybe I'm not isolating these guys in the player grid. Kamara's in the player grid, but maybe I'm not isolating Olave and Shaheed in the player grid, but I am going to sprinkle them in. They might be on some single entry 3 max rosters. Again, surrounded by these other core pieces that I have confidence in. But given that this is a Cardinals roster in particular, I want to say, let's go ahead and pull the bring back in, practice builds. Let's see what we can do here. So we're going to throw in Kamara, and then I'm going to pull in Bijan Robinson. And so what I want to do here is take a quick look at Bijan Robinson's game logs in the last 12 games of last year when they started really emphasizing him. And what we see is how many games, we just looked at Jamar Chase's game logs, right? How many games is Bijan Robinson across his last 12 under 20 points? 2 out of 12 games? How many times is he under 17 points? 1 out of 12 games. So compare that to Jamar Chase. Now, we don't have the 58 pointers and the 44 pointers here from Bijan Robinson, but in terms of the floor we're starting from, is actually quite a bit higher than Jamar Chase. Now, I don't like the matchup for Bijan Robinson. I think he's much likelier to finish in this 20-point range than the 30-point range, but I want to have some level of exposure to him to say he is the kind of guy who could post 35 points, who could be a piece that you had to have on the slate, and he's going to be highly owned or somewhat highly owned. And so I want to make sure that I'm not getting left behind trying to outsmart the field on somebody like Bijan Robinson, right? So I might be underweight the field on Bijan Robinson this week, but I'll still have a decent amount of exposure. I'll still make sure I have him. I think I'll make sure I have him on some of my single entry 3 max rosters. So on this particular practice build, we're going to throw Bijan Robinson in here and see what that does to the rest of our roster. So we're going to throw in, we've already got Bijan Robinson, we've got Alvin Kamara in here, and now we're going to see about a Bucks player. So Bucks player, we're going to throw in Mike Evans and see if we can make all of this work. We could also throw in Emeka Egbuka and do something different with our salary. We're going to throw in a 49ers player because we've been talking about that. And so Ricky Pearsall is a guy who broad range of outcomes. We know that the ceiling is there, and this leaves us with only $3,200 in salary. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go to, again, practice build. I'm going to go to Alec Aomanar, who's going to be the number 2 or number 3 receiver for Tennessee. So as I do this and I fill out these last few spots, I start to see some things. So this is the process I went through last night, building these practice builds. And I say, okay, instead of Aomanar, we could also take him out and put in Hunter Renfrow. So Renfrow is 3,200, so we get Hunter Renfrow in here, and he also fits. But then we also, I know from playing around with rosters all week, there's a lot of 4,600 wide receivers I like. There's Josh Downs, there's Rashid Shaheed. We're not going to Shaheed on this roster because we have Kamara, but could we go back down to Aomanar and then go up to, from Pearsall up to Downs? So now we've got another way to roll out this roster. If we're doing MME, I can kind of start with this core and then start playing around with things. What also happens sometimes is as I start playing around with things, I actually get deeper and deeper into the playing around with things and end up on a roster that I wouldn't have, kind of like a little cul-de-sac off of the main road, right? That I wouldn't have started there as a destination, but because I started down this main road destination, I end up finding this cul-de-sac, or maybe there's a side road and then a cul-de-sac off of that side road that it's like, oh, I never would have found this without this practice build. And you just end up on a comprehensive roster that you end up really liking. So now we're going to say, what if we move from, we're kind of cramping ourselves with salary. Well, first we're actually going to go Aomanar, we're going to go from Downs back down to Pearsall. And we're going to say, because on this particular roster, we don't have one of these Dolphins pieces. And so then we're going to go from Mike Evans up to Tyreek Hill. So now instead of a Bucks piece, we have a Dolphins piece. If we'd had the salary, an extra 100, we also could have gone then from Pearsall up to Emeka Egbuka to stick with one of these Bucks pieces. Now we're going to go from, we're going to say, okay, now we're kind of cramping ourselves with the salary. What can we do if we let go of Bijan Robinson and move down to Achane. So moving down to Achane is going to save us some salary, give us some extra flexibility. Because we have Achane, we're going to move from Hill back down to Mike Evans. So now this roster, in case you're listening and not watching, it's the same starting point, this Kyler Murray, Marvin Harrison Jr., and Trey McBride with an Alvin Kamara bringback still. And now we're filling out the rest of the roster with Mike Evans, Bucks, Ricky Pearsall, 49ers. And then we've got a bunch of extra salary. We don't need Alec Aomanar anymore down here at 3,100. And so we're going to say, what can we do down here? So once we move here, trying to remember what we ended up doing on this particular one. Oh, that's right. So we end up having the money to, well, I lost my track on this one. So what we're going to do next then is we're actually going to go down to, so I end up going off of Kamara and down to Chuba Hubbard, which allows us to come over to Rashid Shaheed at exactly 4,600, which is what we have left. And so again, this is just showing you how we sort of move around. And then we kind of get to a roster that does sort of fit into, when I built it, it sort of fit into this, like not a pathway I would have gone down, but this side street off the main street into a cul-de-sac that I would not have seen without this. You realize, okay, now we've got Achane and Hubbard, but what if we go all the way down at running back? What if we go down to Alvin Kamara? Now we don't need Rashid Shaheed. And I've been thinking a lot about David Njoku as a flex play, because if you just look through the numbers, his floor and ceiling range of outcomes is actually as good as or better than most other wide receivers priced around him. And so now we've got David Njoku in the flex. You're doing something different. You've got him with Trey McBride. And then you can do two things here. You go Steelers defense up to Broncos, or we're going to go on this one, Ricky Pearsall up to, we like the Jags passing attack. We've trying to loop in some Brian Thomas Jr. All these guys are in this player grid, right? And we end up putting in Travis Hunter. So if you're listening, this roster now ends up with Kyler Murray, Marvin Harrison Jr., Trey McBride, Alvin Kamara as the bringback, which is kind of where we started. We moved off of it. We moved back to it. Now we've got Chuba Hubbard on the Panthers. We've got Travis Hunter on the Jags. And so we've got this chance to play into a game environment that we like with two players who are capable of putting up big points in this particular game environment. We've got David Njoku down here in the flex, another player who we like. We've got Mike Evans from the Bucks, who we like, all with the Steelers defense, who we like. And so you can kind of see how this whole process goes, sort of flowing through building rosters and getting from point A to point B, doing some practice build, and how we're leveraging the player grid in order to sort of maximize what we're wanting to do here. Now, the last thing I want to show you, which is really cool, is I moved these rosters over to the Bink machine. So what you can do is you can you go to lineups. If you've never used the Bink machine before, and even if you're a hand builder, this is all going to be hand build stuff. Okay, you go to lineups, you click this little plus button, and you add a group. So this is called hand builds angles. So these are these 8 rosters that we just talked about. There's one I lost my train of thought on, so I think we talked about 7. But these are these 8 rosters that we just talked about in the show. So you can come over to players in the Bink machine, over to this hand build tab over here, which you just click this hand build button, and then you can hand build, right? And then down at the bottom, you just pick which bucket you want to add it to. I add it to this hand builds angles podcast. So now I've got 8 hand build lineups in here, and I can come over to the lineups tab, and I can pick a small field single entry, 100 plus entrants, and run the sims on it and see how these rosters against the simulations would stack up in this type of build. And what we see is 34% ROI is our best one. That's not great. These are not all small field rosters. But what if we start thinking about large field 3 max, where some people aren't going to take as many risks in large field 3 max because they only get to build 3 rosters. All of a sudden, this Kyler roster, this one with Hunter Renfrow, who, again, comes down to projections, and it comes down to simulations, it comes down to ownership. And so some of this is, this isn't 100% perfect, right? But this is great information to be able to pull in. And the deeper into the season we get, the more powerful this will get, because this is week 1. We're still trying to understand how to project these players. As we get deeper into the season and understand these players' roles and what these teams look like, these projections are going to get more and more powerful. These sims are going to get more and more powerful. And we see that this roster right here, obviously, they like Hunter Renfrow in projections this week, so that helps on this particular roster. But it shoots up to 111% ROI. It shows us that it would be expected to finish in the top 0.1%, roughly 0.4% of the time. So 4x the mark that the average roster would have, way ahead of the math there on this particular roster. We even see that all of these rosters would be expected, all of them except one, the Drake May one, would be expected to finish in the top 0.1%, more than 0.1% of the time. Now, some of these that have negative ROI, we can actually view it and we can see why. So it's going to finish in the top 0.1%. or top 100% X amount of times, but then you see that it's tapering off too quickly. And so it wouldn't actually make enough money on the low end to make up for the money that it makes on the high end would be the expectation. But this is a really cool tool to be able to leverage to see, okay, maybe this Kyler roster with Kamara, with Bijan Robinson, with Hunter Renfrow, basically, and Ricky Pearsall, basically one of the first ones, the second one that we built here. Maybe it's not great for small field, but large field 3 max. Now let's check out large field mass multi-entry and see where this would fit into that one. So if we run the sims for large field mass multi-entry, again, we see the ROI drop. So why is that? Because we're gonna have more people taking swings on crazier things in large field mass multi-entry. And so this one isn't in that sweet spot for large field mass multi-entry. But again, if we come down to large field 3 max, where people can only build 3 rosters, and we run the sims, and we're going to see that this ROI on this is expected to be pretty good in this spot. And so just a really incredible tool to be able to use and to be able to balance what you're doing with your rosters and how you're maximizing what you can do with your rosters. So with that, we are going to wrap things up. I've got to be on with Squirrel Patrol here in about 12 minutes. So I'm going to be off here in about 5, but we're going to wrap this up with the bottom-up build. And bottom-up build, for those of you who are new here, it used to be like literally just start from the bottom at each position and who was the player I felt most confident in at each position. Then we started doing bottom-up build as a strict 44K salary cap and running out a bottom-up build contest for the OWS community. That will come back in week 2. Where we all compete against each other, free entry, and try to build a roster with a 44K salary cap. And what's cool about that is it allows you to think outside the box in terms of how am I maximizing ceiling, not just who are the cheap players, but how am I maximizing ceiling. So bottom-up build this week, Joe Flacco, David Njoku, easy starting point for me because it's the cheapest stack that I really like. And I go through all the numbers there in the player grid and why I really like this setup this week. But that was an easy one if we're trying to build for as much ceiling as possible with a 44K salary cap. The next thing I did on this roster was I put on Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt, who I believe is going to be the starting running back for the Commanders. Obviously, we're taking on some risk there with this supposition, but I do think that we're going to see him priced at 5.2Ks, 4K this week. I think we're going to see him priced at 5.2K next week, even without, maybe he's up to like 4.9 or 5.1, but I think his role is going to be big enough that even if he doesn't produce this week, DraftKings is going to have to say, oh, well, like his role is bigger than this price tag implies, therefore we have to bump up his price. And I think there's a chance that we're paying more than 6K for him deeper into the season. So getting him at 4K is really nice value. He's not going to be a staple for me this week, but he is a guy I'll mix in a little bit when I'm trying to do something different or save salary at the running back position. And so on a 44K salary cap build, I'm going to do that here. This allows me then to take swings and say, is there a way to fit in Christian McCaffrey? Is there a way to fit in Mike Evans? Is there a way to fit in Trey McBride in the flex here? So we just looked at a Kyler, Marvin Harrison Jr., Trey McBride, David Njoku roster. Now we have David Njoku as the first tight end on, Trey McBride in the flex, but getting these two guys in together. So I'm not trying to put one of these 3K tight ends in the flex because then you're saying, hopefully they get 7 points. Like what's the value of 7 points in a covering a flex spot, right? What I like about Njoku, Trey McBride, George Kittle, and you can throw Brock Bowers in there this week, is they're all capable of scoring 30 points. And they're all capable of outscoring the wide receivers priced around them. So getting Trey McBride on here was a fun way to do something a little bit different. And then we're able to, finish this off with the Texans defense, where I don't love the matchup against the Rams, not a mistake-prone team, but you have one of the best defenses in football with a great pass rush. And, Matthew Stafford's back issues, maybe something happens there. So you have the Texans in here at 2,500 to save some salary. You've got Hunter Renfrow, starting slot wide receiver for the Panthers, and is capable of getting open. People aren't going to want to play him, 3,200, saving some salary there. And then Josh Downs, who high floor, but also he has ceiling at his 4,600 price tag. And that ends up being exactly 44K in salary spent, leaving us with 6K left over. So again, that's Joe Flacco plus David Njoku as the starting point. Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt and Christian McCaffrey at running back. Trey McBride as a tight end in the flex. 3 wide receivers in Hunter Renfrow, Josh Downs, and Mike Evans. And then the Texans defense, 44K in salary spent. And I think we did it. That's it. That's week 1 in the books. Yeah, every week's going to be a little bit different in the Angles podcast because, again, I've really, over the last couple of years, this into something that's not redundant. If you read my content throughout the week and you've watched my show with Pete and you've read the player grid, I don't want you to come to the Angles podcast and just get all the same information regurgitated. So we're trying to hit on some different angles and some different things that we might not have talked about in other places. And I think that this hopefully is really powerful for you in terms of understanding how I think through that player pool and the player grid. It's not, let me just take a roster and build with these players. We're still getting creative outside of that, but then saying, where are we plugging in pieces? Okay, let me pull my highest confidence pieces in. So whether my highest confidence pieces are yours or not, think about it that way in terms of your highest confidence pieces. You might only put one roster in play each week. You might only put 5 rosters in play each week, but hopefully you're not building only 1 or 5 rosters. Hopefully you're building 20 rosters. Hopefully you're building 40 rosters. Hopefully you're building 50 rosters and allowing yourself to find those cul-de-sacs off the side streets that you might not otherwise have found. Those thoughts of like I said, building these practice rosters last night was helping me understand, okay, how do I value the Achane and Tyreek barbell of putting one of these guys on a given roster and digging into the numbers there. And so you can start to get higher confidence on who your high confidence plays are and how you're building those rosters each week. And so, hopefully that was valuable for all of you. And check out The Sims, whether you're an OWS subscriber or not. Check out the Bink Machine, The Sims. I really, really encourage you to use The Sims this week. I know a lot of you, the majority of DFS players, it's not going to be in your bankroll to do that all season, but I think it's really, there's actually a single lineup Sims that's only $20 a month. I already mentioned that, but then you can just sort of add your lineups and run the Sims on them. And I think that's probably worthwhile for any single entry 3 max player because that's not that onerous of an expense. Our hands are, obviously we love to charge less for this, but it's expensive to actually run the Sims, like per query. It ends up costing the database and all that. So our hands are kind of tied on what we're able to charge here. And this is the lowest that we can charge on the Sims. But I do think that it's going to be extremely valuable for those of you who are using it. I'm excited to be using it every week. And week 1 is free. So get in there and use it this week. I really think it's a powerful tool to leverage this week. So with that, I'm going to get out of here. I will see you on the site throughout the weekend. I will have my Winner Circle podcast on the 1 Week Season podcast feed on Saturday night. And that's going to be my last thoughts before I start building. And then I will have my update to the player grid before I go to bed Saturday night, which is, like 1 a.m. on the West Coast. So like 4 a.m. Eastern, 5 a.m. Eastern, usually around there. My update is on the player grid, which kind of lays out my exposures and whatnot on the week. So I will see you on the site throughout the weekend, and I will see you at the top of the leaderboards on Sunday.